Immortals Fenyx Rising is the best Ubisoft game that I've ever played. Immortals Fenyx Rising is a terrible, terrible name for a video game, but it's actually a really good video game. I'd even go so far as to say it's a great game that clearly wears its influences on its sleeve. If you've seen anything about this game, it would have been extremely obvious that this is what you'd get if you put Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Breath of the Wild into a blender. You've got your light attack, heavy attack, dodge, special abilities tied to the L1 button layout from Odyssey, and gliding, stamina management while climbing anything, exploration and puzzle focus of Breath of the Wild. This really is an amalgamation of those two games and many others. And I know a lot of people will probably roll their eyes at someone comparing this to Breath of the Wild, but it's honestly unavoidable at this point. There's a much larger discussion here in regards to comparing games to each other. If you're in the Souls community at all, you would see that a lot of people hate when someone compares a game to Dark Souls, but sometimes it's just easier to say this game is like this other game so people can quickly and easily understand what you're talking about. I digress. Immortals Fenyx Rising is your standard open world exploration action game with light RPG elements that Ubisoft is known for. But unlike many of their recent titles, this actually has some personality shoved into it. The graphics are a nice change up, as most other Ubi games are going for realism, but Immortals throws that out the window and goes for a more cartoony, vibrant look. Definitely not reminiscent of Breath of the Wild. Not at all. As far as art style is concerned, this game will age beautifully, and it's refreshing to play a game that isn't your standard realism with a muted colour palette. Story-wise, Immortals doesn't take itself too seriously. Characters are constantly trying to be funny, and yeah, a lot of the time the humour doesn't land, but there's no doubt in my mind that I'll remember the presentation of this story for a long time to come. Combat here is just fantastic. It's not going to be the most sophisticated combat system you'll ever experience, but it feels great to play. Fenyx controls very snappily. Having the ability to cancel attacks whenever you want, and immediately do something else keeps combat smooth and tight. Progression is streamlined from other open worlds, cutting out a lot of the fat with useless items, equipment that will never be used, and having an easy to understand, no fuss upgrade system. The world is also a joy to explore, and actually requires you to scout out the environment to ping different landmarks, collectibles, and activities on your map. Your map doesn't get filled out by itself. That is up to you, and this same philosophy carries through to the puzzles. Most mission objectives in the game will be locked behind some type of puzzle, but Immortals will never tell you how to solve it. The game wants you to look around the environment for clues, for you to learn a lesson, so the next stage of the puzzle can build off of what you just learned. You've certainly seen most of this before, and that might drag on some, but everything has such a quality to it. Everything is streamlined in a way that isn't wanting to waste your time, while not sacrificing on depth. If you couldn't tell already, I think this game is fantastic, and if you want to know more, stick around for the rest of the review. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video, please leave me a like and subscribe. Also, what's your favourite Ubisoft game? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's start with the story and the overall setup for Immortals. Typhon, the most prominent villain in Greek mythology, has escaped the depths of hell and has momentarily overthrown the gods, stealing their godly essence and robbing them of their powers. The protagonist of this story, Fenyx, has been shipwrecked on a beach. This is where you'll create your own unique Fenyx, from a fairly adequate character creator. You have the option of 2 different body types, to change hairstyles, face paint, voice, and so on. Fenyx now awakens on the beach and finds that everyone has been turned to stone, including your brother. From here, you'll gain access to your weapons by completing the different vaults of Tartarus scattered around the tutorial region. More on them in just a minute. You'll eventually run into Hermes, who guides you to the Hall of the Gods and urges you to seek out the help of the remaining gods. It is very important to note that all of this, the story, the gameplay, the puzzles, are all being narrated by Zeus and Prometheus. When Typhon had stolen the gods' powers, that also included Zeus himself. So he retreated to the top of a mountain where Prometheus was imprisoned, and that is where Prometheus is retelling Fenyx's story to Zeus. And that's the setup for Immortals. The lands are filled with stone statues of people, the gods are either missing or powerless, and the creatures from the vaults of Tartarus are roaming the lands. But the story and writing aren't just bland window dressing for what you'll be doing. The story isn't used in the same way as Breath of the Wild. See, the story in that game is used to get you out in the open world and explore, and that's the best thing that story could have asked from the player. However, there has been a lot of effort put into this writing for it to be funny. Everything here is a joke, or leading up to a joke, or responding to a joke. It is relentless in its pursuit for comedy, and like anything that's constantly trying to be funny, sometimes the jokes land, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you want the characters to just shut up so you can get on with what you were doing, and other times you'll be laughing and having a good time. But what I loved most about the writing was how they handled the gods. See, there are 4 gods that need to be rescued, and you need to get their essences back, but each of them have been transformed into a shell of their former selves. I'll only spoil one of the gods because it was my favourite, and that has to be Ares. The brutal, violent and untamed god of war has been turned into a prideless rooster. When you first encounter Ares, he's pretending to be a bear to hide his current form, and when he finally does reveal himself, it's obvious he's given up on fighting back, all while comedy is ensuing. In all honesty, I think a lot of people will dislike this writing, or at the very least think it's annoying. And at times, I definitely agree with that, but as a whole, I enjoyed this quite a lot. I love that it took a risk. It stands out from other games, and definitely stands out from the rest of Ubisoft's catalogue.
By the gods, where did you come from?
What I noticed the first time I spread my wings and started gliding around the open world was the incredible draw distance, the vibrancy of this world and the sheer density of it. Firstly, draw distance. When you're standing high above the rest of the world, on top of a statue, or a mountain, or whatever, you'll notice you can see basically everything. There is no end in sight. You'll also notice that each region has a distinctive look to it. The first region, where the Hall of the Gods is located, is your standard grassy, vibrant landscape with rolling hills. But Ares' zone couldn't be more opposite. It's filled with destroyed castles, siege weapons, burnt landscapes. It is a war zone, and the entire region is like that, contrasting beautifully with the starting zone. Likewise with Hephaestus' zone. Since he's a blacksmith, his entire region is based on his forge. There are 5 main regions throughout Immortals, and they all look distinctively different from one another, and with an art style this great, and such a wide visual palette, makes for one tremendously good looking game. That's enough of the visuals. Now, what do you actually do in this world? Like I mentioned earlier, you need to scout out the environment. This system works by you using your telescope and revealing the different activities around the map. Admittedly, this can be a bit cheesy because you have X-ray vision, tagging stuff through walls, but it's a nice change up from the traditional map marker open world. These include chests that are sometimes guarded by enemies or locked behind a puzzle, movement puzzles where you need to traverse the environment to a specific point before the timer runs out, arrow puzzles that require you to control an arrow and sequentially go through the hilts of axes, constellation puzzles that require you to find 5 or 6 blue orbs hidden around the environment, vaults of Tartarus which work exactly like Breath of the Wild shrines, and many more things. There are a lot of activities scattered throughout this world, and they're all really well designed. They don't feel repetitive because there aren't hundreds of any one type. They're pretty unique when compared to other open world games, and they're just fun to play around with. In addition to everything in this open world being designed really well, I really loved how dense this game is. For starters, this is quite a small world. It's a fraction of the size of recent Assassin's Creed games, and it's probably about half the size of Breath of the Wild, and far from that being a negative, I always see that as a positive. Ubisoft has used every square inch of this world to its greatest potential, and you will never be running around for more than 20 seconds without having something to do or seeing something interesting in the distance. I would constantly plan my journey to the next main quest, only to find myself getting distracted by a string of puzzles and unlockables. Most importantly, if you don't get much enjoyment out of open world activities, or you just want to beeline through the main quest, you can absolutely do that because there's no level gating here. Enemies won't one-shot you because you haven't grinded enough. No region is locked behind prerequisite tasks. You have the ability to go wherever you want, right from the start. This open world looks fucking incredible. It's refreshing to explore a world with my eyes instead of a map telling me where to go constantly, and the activities within this world are fun and engaging. But it's time to talk about my favourite aspects of Immortals, the puzzles and the combat. I'm probably going to get a lot of shit for saying this, but in my personal opinion, I believe Immortals Fenyx Rising has a better combat system and better puzzles than Breath of the Wild. I know, you can dislike the video now and leave an angry comment. No, but seriously, combat and puzzles here are fantastic. There's a few pillars that hold up combat and make it what it is. Firstly is the snappy responsiveness of the controls that I'm sure most players will resonate with within the first few minutes. Fenyx is a very mobile character. He can sprint, dodge, double jump and glide. You can easily move around both the environment and fights, and the sense of freedom that brings is fantastic. When in combat, your combos come rapidly, whether you're using your axe, which can stun opponents, or your sword, which has a higher DPS output. What keeps combat fluid and tight is the animation cancelling. You can cancel an attack at any point in the animation, meaning you can respond to anything an enemy is about to do. If you're mid-attack and an enemy is about to throw a boulder at you, you can dodge instantly. If an enemy is about to hit you, you can perform a parry mid-attack. This sense of fluidity with animation cancelling excels once you gain access to your god powers. These include Ares' Wrath, which raise a bunch of spears around you and knocks most enemies into the air, Athena's Dash, which does exactly what it sounds like, it lets you dash in a direction. Then you have Hephaestus' Hammer, which does massive damage to an enemy. Lastly, there is Apollo's Arrow and Hercules' Strength, which can be used for combat, but are much more useful for puzzles. Once you start weaving in god powers with your attacks, you realize that these were designed to be used more as mobility tools rather than damage abilities. Early fights will start out like regular one-on-one duels, basic sword attacks with minimal aerial combat, and sometimes performing a perfectly timed dodge which slows down time. But towards the end of the game, you'll be throwing enemies into the air with your swords, you'll pull yourself over to ranged enemies, dash from target to target, and finishing off the remaining enemies with an AoE hit from your hammer. It's at that moment you'll appreciate how smooth this combat system is, and how everything you have available to you complements the rest of your kit. Next are the puzzles that are all very functional and mostly well thought out. I couldn't help but think of God of War's puzzles while playing this, not because they're similar, but in the way that they're never too demanding. You'll usually look at a puzzle and be able to figure it out within a minute, and that's not a bad thing. None of these puzzles are pull your hair out challenging, but none stoop so low as to be a waste of time. While in the Vaults of Tartarus, you'll have to solve puzzles, and there are a surprisingly good amount of variety. One puzzle will have you putting on weights on pressure plates to raise and lower platforms, another will require you to control an arrow to hit a lever to open a door. Another will have you guiding a ball that's being pushed by vents. There's a lot more examples of puzzles. I mean a lot more, and for the most part, I enjoyed them all. It's quite refreshing to play a game like this with actual puzzles. Most open world games just deal with combat and generic activities that throw more combat at you. But breaking up the action with proper, well-designed puzzles was a welcome addition. Okay, time to wrap this review up. Everything I've spoken about so far has been all the great things Immortals does, but like any game, there are a handful of issues. First of all, I did about 80 to 90% of the open world things, and it took me 32 hours to see the credits roll, which is a great amount of content. I would have completed everything Immortals has to offer, but once you go to fight the final boss, you are locked out of the open world. Once you beat him, your game is over. You can either reload a save before the final boss, or start a new game plus. Breath of the Wild also did this, and I don't understand what the point of it is. I've already beaten the game, so I don't care about the thematic inconsistencies now. Just put the world back to the state it was before I finished the game, and let me continue. Secondly is the final boss. I won't spoil it, but you fight him twice in really quick succession. The first time took me all of 10 seconds, and the second time you're required to solve 4 puzzles in between fighting basic enemies, and this felt quite uninspired. Each major puzzle for freeing the 4 different gods is more interesting than the final vault, which is a bit disappointing, and forcing me to fight basic enemies in between each puzzle made it drag a bit. Lastly is the final fight being thematically satisfying, but mechanically dull. You're constantly being interrupted with cutscenes every 15 seconds, and this happens like 6 or 7 times. No joke, I honestly would have preferred for this just to have been one long cutscene. A bit of a shame the end of the game fizzles out, but overall I was satisfied with the ending, and my problems are basically nitpicks. Now, my lack of criticism towards Immortals does not make it a masterpiece, but it does mean that everything is either really good or great, and that's all I could ask for. The devs weren't trying to create something revolutionary. Instead, they took 2 games that are really good and smashed them together, and potentially made something greater than the sum of its parts, even if those parts are already great. I loved this in all honesty. I loved the combat, the puzzles, the exploration, the visuals. I really appreciate and commend the writing, even if it didn't land 100% of the time. If you haven't played this because you thought it looked like a rip-off of Breath of the Wild, or a childish Assassin's Creed, then I cannot recommend this highly enough. I hope we see Ubisoft and other developers create more games like this. Thanks for getting to the end of the review. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and my next video will be on Returnal, which comes out in just a few days. Don't forget to leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't already.